Indian Air Force, the aerial wing of the Indian Armed Forces, the fourth strongest air force in the world. Indian Air Force was formed as an auxiliary force for the British Royal Air Force on 8 October 1931, with its first squadron commissioned on 1 April of 1933. 4 Westland Wapiti biplanes and 4 Indian pilots were inducted into the squadron. Subsequently, more squadrons were inducted, and with the onset of the World War II, the Air Force saw an even more rapid expansion. Squadrons as well as new aircraft, including the US-built Vultee Vengeance, Douglas DC-3, the British Hawker Hurricane, Supermarine Spitfire, and Westland Lysander were added to its fleet. During the World War, the Indian Air Force was mainly involved in strike, close air support, bomber escort, and pathfinding missions over Southeast Asia against the Japanese. In recognition of the services rendered by the Indian Air Force, King George VI conferred the prefix Royal in 1945. Thereafter, the Indian Air Force were referred to as Royal Indian Air Force. With the partition of India into 2 separate nations, India and Pakistan, the military forces were also partitioned. 3 of the 10 operational squadrons and facilities located within the borders of Pakistan were transferred to the Royal Pakistan Air Force. The reduced personnel and fleet was a major setback for the Indian Air Force. Within 2 months of partition, India was involved in the First War, the Indo-Pak War of 1947. Although Air Force did not have a major role to play in the war, the Air Force was pivotal in airlifting troops into the war zone and saving the city of Srinagar from an imminent invasion. When India became a republic in 1950, the prefix Royal was dropped from the Indian Air Force. At the same time, the current IAF roundel was adopted. The 1950s were mostly spent slowly building up the fleet with additions of Hawker Tempest, the Havilland Vampire, Dassault Lahogan, English Electric Canberra, Hawker Hunter, etc. The first conflicts post-independence where the Indian Air Force was actively involved was the Congo Crisis in 1960, where the 5 Squadron, equipped with English Electric Canberra, supported the United Nations operation in the Congo. This was followed up with the liberation of Goa and Daman and Diu in 1961, where the waves of Canberra bombed the Double M runway in order to cripple the Portuguese. As the Air Force was never utilized in the Indochina War of 1962, the war that the Indian Air Force was involved with in its full entirety was the Indo-Pak War of 1965. This was the first time that the Indian Air Force actively engaged an enemy air force, and their inexperience in aerial warfare was evident. Furthermore, aged and qualitatively inferior aircrafts in the fleet proved detrimental to the Indian Air Force. The aerial warfare began on the 1st September 1965 and went on till ceasefire was established on 22nd September of the same year. The initial operations were to carry out close air support missions in the support of Indian troops. The Indian Air Force, using de Havilland Vampires, bombed Pakistani positions and attacked Pakistani tanks and ground targets, though a lot of damage from the friendly fire was also reported later on. In retaliation, Pakistani Air Force employed F-86 Sabres. In the ensuing dogfight, 4 Indian Air Force Vampires were lost to the Sabres. This, along with the incidents of friendly fire, forced Indian Air Force to immediately withdraw about 130 Vampires together with over 50 Lohogans from the frontline service. The initial disappointment in the battle necessitated the Indian Air Force to send the fallen Nat fighters to the frontline. The Nats, complemented by the Dassault Mysterious, proved to be effective against the F-86 Sabres. Various Sabres and starfighters were down during the conflict, although quite a few Indian Nats were also lost. The Nats' effectiveness against the Sabre earned it the nickname Sabre Slayer by the media. Both sides claimed victory in the air war, with Pakistan claiming to have destroyed 104 enemy aircraft against its own loss of 19, while India claiming to have destroyed 73 enemy aircraft and lost 35 of its own. Despite the intense fighting, the conflict was effectively a stalemate. The unimpressive consequences of the 1965 war led the Indian Air Force to undergo substantial overhaul of aircraft fleet as well as major refinement in its war tactics. The first major change in the Indian Air Force came with the introduction of the first indigenously built fighter aircraft in India, the H-24 Marut built by HAL. Along with Marut, HAL started manufacturing various other aircrafts under license from different companies. This included an improved version of Fallen Nat, known as HAL Ajit. Around the same time, Indian Air Force included the Sukhoi Su-7 and MiG-21, both of whom will go on to play a pivotal role in the wars to come. 3rd December 1971, at 5:40 p.m., 50 Pakistani Air Force planes attacked 11 Indian Air Force bases in Pathankot, Amritsar, Ambala, Agra, Sirsa, Uttarlai, Jaisalmer, Jodhpur and Jamnagar. This was in retaliation due to the India supporting Bangladesh Liberation Army in its war of independence from East Pakistan. Pakistan hoping that the attack would cripple the Indian Air Force in the west and they would occupy as much area in the west as possible, which they would bargain if East Pakistan fell. Little did they know about the outcome of one of the shortest wars in history. That night, India officially declared war on Pakistan. Simultaneously, the Indian Air Force Canberras were armed and ready for their foray deep into Pakistan. These flew against 8 western Pakistani air bases, inflicting heavy damages to some of the air bases. Through the night, the Indian Air Force also struck the main East Pakistani airfields of Tejgaon. At the same time, the Indian Air Force was deploying additional aircraft to its forward airfields for the strikes that were to follow the next morning. Within days, India was able to achieve air superiority in the war. The Indian Air Force was able to conduct a wide range of missions: troop support, air combat, deep penetration strikes, para-dropping behind enemy lines, feints to draw enemy fighters away from the actual target, bombing and reconnaissance. The Pakistani Air Force, which was solely focused on air combat, was blown out of the subcontinent skies within first week of the war. One of the most successful air raids by India into West Pakistan happened on 8 December 1971, when Indian Hunter aircraft from the Pathankot-based 20 Squadron attacked the Pakistani base in Murid and destroyed 5 F-86 aircraft on the ground. By the end of the war, Pakistan faced one of the most humiliating defeats, with more than about 93,000 Pakistani troops surrendering and liberating East Pakistan into the newly formed Bangladesh. The next 25 years were pretty calm for the Indian Air Force. Apart from small support roles in Operation Meghdoot, Operation Poomalai, and Operation Pavan, Indian Air Force devoted its time in overhauling and upgrading its fleet. During the 1980s, India added a slew of fighter jets into its fleet. This included the MiG-23, MiG-27, the Jaguar, Dassault Mirage 2000, and the MiG-29, which is considered to be one of the top fighter aircraft today. On 11th May 1999, the Indian Air Force was called in to provide close air support to the Indian Army at the height of the war with the use of helicopters. The Indian Air Force strike was codenamed Operation Safed Sagar. The first strikes were launched on 26th May with MiG-27s carrying out offensive sorties, with MiG-21s and later MiG-29s providing fighter cover. The Indian Air Force also deployed its radars and MiG-29 fighters in vast numbers to keep check on Pakistani military movement across the border. Some losses were also incurred during the initial battle, and these losses forced the Indian Air Force to reassess its strategy. The helicopters were immediately withdrawn from offensive roles, as infiltrators were carrying portable missiles. On 30th May, the Indian Air Force called into operation the Mirage 2000, which was deemed the best aircraft capable under conditions of high altitude seen in the zone of conflict. Mirage 2000s not only had a better defense equipment compared to the MiGs, but also gave Indian Air Force the ability to carry out aerial raids at night. The MiG-29s were used extensively to provide fighter escort to Mirage 2000. The Mirage successfully targeted enemy camps and logistic bases in Kargil, and within days, the supply lines were severely disrupted. Mirage 2000s were used for the strikes on heavily defended Tiger Hill and paved the way for their early recapture. At the height of the conflict, the Indian Air Force was conducting over 40 sorties daily over the Kargil region. By 26 July, the Indian Air Forces had successfully liberated Kargil from Pakistani forces.